me here today to talk about my PhD work on cougars. So I guess I don't need to introduce myself. That was a great summary. But before I get into the details about my research, I'll just go over a bit about what we know about cougar distributions in North America and what we know about them in British Columbia. Okay, so many of you may or may not be aware that cougars used to occur all throughout North America, from Vancouver Island to where I'm from in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So we used to get cougars all over the place, but from the 1800s into the 1900s, up until about the 60s, cougars were intensively persecuted, essentially extirpated from the eastern portion of their range. So there used to be bounties on cougars, lots of persecution of cougars and other carnivores too, like gray wolves, and they were essentially limited to the western side of the continent. They occur beyond North America too, so they occur from about the southern Yukon all the way down to Patagonia. But today we have extant populations of Florida panther occurring still isolated in Florida, and then we have continued migration of cougar breeding populations further east. So this has been documented in the Dakota Badlands, as well as in Saskatchewan. So where you guys are, or not quite where you are, but in the Cypress Hills, there was documented evidence of a breeding population of cougars just in the last 10 to 15 years. So that was in the southwestern portion of the province. So cougars are moving further east, and we're learning more and more why. And we want to know more about why they might be not only moving eastward, but what potential implications there are for cougar distributions further north in the future, with factors like climate change and increasing white-tailed deer distributions farther north. So cougar populations are affected by multiple different processes from the top down and the bottom up. So they're influenced by management of cougars, removing animals directly from the population through hunter harvest or human wildlife conflict or livestock depredation. They're also affected by bottom up processes like broad scale landscape change that affects primary productivity and plant growth for herbivores that they consume, and this reverberates through the food web. So many people think about cougar predation of their prey species, namely deer, as being this linear relationship between cougars and their ungulate prey and vegetation. But what we know about cougars is that they're more of an ecosystem engineer, because they provide so much biomass to many other species on the landscape. So they not only eat ungulate prey, this is about 80% of their diet across their North American range. This varies across geographic area, but they also eat small mammals too. So they'll consume snowshoe hare, porcupine, or raccoons. On the coast, they'll even eat pinnipeds. So they have a quite diverse diet. But cougars share the landscape in most areas with many other predators. So they interact directly and indirectly with black bears and grizzly bears, wolves and coyotes, other mesocarnivores, and even birds of prey that scavenge carrion that they provide on the landscape. But an important factor to know about cougars and their relationships with other species is that they're influenced by people at every stage. So we alter the landscape directly and indirectly through forest harvesting and clear cutting, urbanization and such, wildfires, and we also directly harvest ungulate prey. We manage other predators. So it's important to remember that people are a very important factor in this food web. So like I mentioned, cougars are managed from this top-down approach through management or hunter harvest. They also enter into competition directly with other predators. They can get killed from other cougars, competing with one another. They're also affected by more natural causes of landscape change from the bottom up, like beetle bark disease or wildfire climate change as well. So what we know about cougars in British Columbia, they're managed as a game species here, and they're managed for several different reasons. So sustainable cougar harvest is a big one, caribou conservation in the central mountain herds, livestock depredation, and human wildlife conflict, to name a few. This map here shows records of cougar harvest locations and sightings since the 70s. So you can see that most cougar sightings occur in the southern portion of British Columbia. What you can't tell from this figure is that a lot of these more northern locations are actually from just the last 10 to 20 years. So it's possible that humans are just developing more of the north and we're occurring in more areas where we see cougars up north, or it could be that cougars are moving north. So we don't really know the relationship between cougar distributions and their latitude increase. But why do we need to study cougars in BC? Don't we know enough about them? So cougars are very elusive and difficult to monitor. There hasn't been a large-scale cougar study in British Columbia in about 20 years. There are a number of smaller GPS collaring or density projects that have occurred in different regions, but nothing extremely comprehensive. So what we're looking for is more information on the population size and density of cougars in BC, more information on their age and sex structure and how they respond to current harvest regulations. We don't know very much about reproduction and recruitment in the population and their role as important predators in declining interior mule deer and other ungulates of importance like bighorn sheep, or even elk populations and moose and white-tailed deer. We also don't know a lot about how landscape change is affecting cougar distribution. So for instance, increasing fire severity and intensity in BC, how does that affect cougars? We don't really know that. So this figure on the right is from a population abundance estimate from the government. This is just for the Thompson Okanagan area. It's combined because there wasn't enough data to look at the Okanagan area on its own. That's one of our study areas. But you can see from these estimates from hunter harvest data, they were estimating kind of a peak in cougar populations in the 90s and then this decline through the 2000s, maybe a bit of recovery in more recent years. But what you can notice is that these confidence intervals here for these estimates are huge. So we don't know if we really have 600 cougars in the Thompson Okanagan or if there's anywhere from 350 to 1200. So we really have a lack of data on cougars to better inform management in the province. So like I mentioned, cougars are important predators of declining interior mule deer. There's another ongoing study in our lab at UBC Okanagan led by PhD student Chloe Wright, and that's on the Southern Interior Mule Deer Project. And Chloe investigates mortalities of GPS collared mule deer. And our study overlaps with hers in these two study areas, the West Okanagan and Boundary, which is from Rock Creek to Grand Forks. And you can see that she's found that cougar predation is the primary cause of her mule deer mortality by far in the Boundary and by some margin in the West Okanagan as well. So there are other causes of mortality for mule deer, but why are cougars by far killing so many mule deer in the Boundary? That is a main question from her research, and we are hoping to answer it. So for my research, I want to know how cougars respond to different landscape change from forestry, roads, agriculture, urbanization, wildfire. What environmental or biological factors might make mule deer more susceptible to cougar predation compared to other ungulate prey? For instance, we have increasing white-tailed deer populations in BC, especially in the Kootenays, and moving westward into the Okanagan. We're seeing more and more whitetails. We also want to know what are the dynamics between cougars and scavengers at their kills. Could there be a relationship between certain scavenging species consuming calories that cougars would otherwise have? Does that make them kill more often than they otherwise would? So what are the relationships there and how does that impact cougar feeding time? So for our study, we are collaring 40 cougars across 3 study areas. Like I mentioned, the West Okanagan and Boundary, and we're also studying cougars in the Kootenays. And we've added the Kootenay study area since this is where cougar hunter harvest is highest in the province. And that's one of our areas of research, is we want to understand more about the implications of our current harvest regulations on the population. There's also more whitetails, more elk in that system, and lower mule deer numbers. So we want a bit of diversity in terms of the study areas so we can make comparisons. So one of the objectives of our study is to look at population dynamics for cougars. So we're looking at survival rates in the population, reproductive rates, territory or home range sizes, population densities, and this is accomplished using biopsy sampling. So we're partnered with the Ministry of forests, land, natural resource operations, and rural development. And they are leading biopsy sampling for cougars in the West Okanagan, and they've previously done this for the Kootenays. We're also collecting cougar hair samples and using camera grids to look at the number of cougar detections in each study area. We can also accomplish some population demographic work with cougar harvest data and compulsory inspection data. So we can use data dating back to the 70s to look at how age structure and sex ratios have changed in the population over time. So one question I get all the time is, how do you catch a cougar? So what we do is we search for fresh cougar tracks in the wintertime, and we use snowmobiles and trucks and chains, and we search for cougar tracks crossing over roads. And we bring trained houndsmen and women out with us, and they let their hounds investigate the tracks. And if they pick up a scent, the hounds will follow the tracks until they find a cougar, and the cougar jumps into a tree. So this is the method that's been used for all kinds of cougar projects across North America. It's tried and true, and we've been using it to catch our cougars. And today we've collared 27 adults, and we've also tracked multiple females to their dens using GPS data, and we also ear tagged 13 kittens that have been born since we started. The GPS collars transmit a point every 2 hours. This is the fixed rate. So we can track where the cougars are going every day. For each location occurs every 2 hours. So what are we trying to do with all this GPS data? We want to examine cougar kill site selection. So we want to understand what cougars are killing and where and when. Look at seasonal differences. So on ungulate winter and summer ranges, for instance. We want to look at the response to roads, burns of different age classes, and cut blocks. Also agriculture, especially in the Okanagan, where there's a lot of agriculture. And topography. We know topography is very important for cougars. They like to hang out in high mountain ridges. It's very difficult field work for us in the winter, but we know that they prefer rugged terrain. So we want to know more about the factors that increase mule deer risk to cougar predation compared to other ungulates. So what is the difference between where mule deer die and where whitetails, elk, and moose die from cougar predation? And is it just linked to habitat preferences? Are cougars intentionally killing mule deer over other ungulates that are available in their home range? So we can look at that and compare some ungulate data we get from cameras as well, and the GPS data we have. So how do we investigate cougar kill sites? We use what's called a cluster analysis. This is used for many apex predator projects. So we use detections of GPS locations that occur within a 72-hour period and about 150 meters apart. And we can identify groupings or clusters of these points, and we drop a center location right in the middle, and we hike to those locations. Whether we can visit a site depends on access a lot of the time. Like I mentioned, they prefer high mountaintops. It can be very far from roads, and we have to use a snowmobile to get relatively close, or we can hike or snowshoe in the winter. So we visit as many of these sites as we can, and we're visiting them year round. So when we're in the field, we collect mortality site investigation data. Like I said, it's year round. We're collecting data on the prey species. We collect hair samples of the prey. We collect their teeth. So we pick up the lower jaw usually and extract the teeth and send them to a lab to get an accurate age estimate. We collect cougar scat as well. So an important note is that this cluster method is biased towards large prey. So like I said in the beginning, only about 80% of cougar kills on average are ungulate species. The other 20% are typically small mammals, and we usually don't detect small mammals on this cluster method because the cougars don't need a long time to consume small prey. So we can only detect carcasses where they spend several days consuming a meal. If we arrive to a smaller cluster point and there's only a cougar bed site and what's called a latrine, so scat is buried nearby, we collect that scat and we might detect smaller prey in that scat if we don't find a larger carcass. But it's important to remember that our study is biased towards large ungulates. We also collect bone marrow to look at body condition in the ungulate prey. And we measure habitat characteristics at the kill sites. And we also install remote cameras at the kills so that we can detect scavengers coming in, and we leave those out for at least 30 days. So just to show you a bit of a breakdown of what we have so far, so we visited over 850 cluster sites across the 3 study areas. An important note at the top here is that our GPS collaring effort, even though we try a lot in the boundary, we've only collared 2 cougars where we could get diet samples from. So as we collect more GPS collar data and we collar more cougars, these numbers should change a bit. But we have detected 550 kill sites, 265 beds, 18 other kills. So sometimes cougars scavenge the kills of other animals, and also den sites. And this isn't necessarily 17 different individual cougars. Rather, each female may move her den multiple times throughout the denning period. But just to show you the differences between our 3 study areas so far, you can see that in the West Okanagan, by far, the main prey source we found is mule deer, and that's drastically different from the Coonies, where mule deer are less prominent in the diet compared to whitetails and elk. And in the boundary, it's more between mule deer and whitetails. So there's a bit of difference here between the 3 study areas so far. Just an example of some of the other things we find at cougar kills. So like I said, cougars might scavenge kills too. So in this bottom right picture, there's an elk that was tangled in barbed wire, and one of our cougars came and fed on that carcass. So that would be an instance of scavenging. We've had a couple times where there have been 2 kills in one location from the same cougar, like that picture in the bottom left. We've had coyotes killed but not consumed, infanticide. So cougars, toms killing the young of other cougars. So we found a kitten at one of our sites that was predated, and things like porcupines and snowshoe hare as well. So to analyze all of this kill site data, we collect this GPS point locations and all these different prey species where animals die. Now we want to analyze it. So we have 2 different data sets that we're kind of working with here, is the cougar telemetry data, and then we're also using the kill site data. So we can use resource selection and step selection functions to understand more about how cougars are using the landscape and their habitat, different habitat characteristics, and also learn where different ungulate prey species are dying. So we can use second order selection to look at where cougars place their home ranges in the area and how much they overlap with one another. We can look at third order selection and see how each individual cougar is using different habitat and where their kills are located. So I won't get into too many details about these methods. Many of you are probably familiar with them, but just to show you, we're using different scales approaches to look at these questions. So some of the environmental variables that we are using in this modeling approach include looking at burns of different age classes, cut blocks, and roads. We're looking at density of these features too, as well as distance to these features. Natural features like water bodies or agriculture areas too. We are looking at terrain, elevation, slope, and aspect, and also vegetation data. So things like canopy height, canopy cover, and different species composition in the sub and dominant canopies. So if you aren't familiar with habitat mapping too, just a quick schematic on the bottom to show you how we use occurrence data, whether it's from the GPS data or from cougar kill sites, and mapping with this environmental data to create an output, which would be essentially a heat map of where we predict cougars to occur, and then also where we predict mule deer to die or whitetails to die. So we'll have different maps that we'll have by the end of the study. I don't have them yet, though. I'm not that far along in my PhD. Another thing I want to account for, not just in terms of environmental or spatial data, is also biological factors. Like I mentioned, we're collecting the age of the species from teeth and also bone marrow. So I can see just from looking at some of these trends in the data we've collected so far, that typically cougars are killing younger, larger ungulates like moose and elk because they're smaller and easier to kill. And we see they don't have any problems killing adult deer. So that's what we would expect. They kill a lot of fawns and calves in the springtime. We can also look at body condition. So Again, not super surprising. We see that body condition is lower in moose that are killed by cougars compared to other ungulates that are smaller. So it's probably a lot easier for a cougar to kill a moose that isn't doing very well compared to some of these smaller ungulates. And then also we can see how these fawns don't really stand a chance after they're born. They don't have enough body fat on them. They're typically killed within the first month or two after they're born. They're killed mainly by bears in that time of year, but the cougars also do kill quite a few fawns. So our lab looks like an episode of Dexter. So we cover everything in plastic and we extract bone marrow by cutting open the bones and we dry them out for 5 days. In a dehydrator. We also pull out the teeth and label them and send them off to a lab. So another thing that we're looking at is not just habitat use, but also cougar movement. And like I mentioned, there's an ongoing Southern Interior Mule Deer project where mule deer are GPS collared in 2 of our 3 study areas. So we've been fortunate that we've detected this happening twice. I'd love it to happen more, Chloe wouldn't, but some of our cougars have killed collared mule deer. So I'll just show you what that's like. We can see that mule deer have very high site fidelity for their migration routes. So mule deer, unlike whitetail, will stick to the same route every year when they go back and forth from their winter to summer range. So we can map these migration routes and see how our cougars are moving in response to these migration pathways and see how cougars move in relation to mule deer. So you can see this is one of Chloe's deer in 2019. You can see they move a long distance for migration, but once they arrive on their summer and winter range, they don't move a lot, or very far, I should say. And you can see one of our cougars on the scene. This is C5 in blue. And you can see how much more the cougar moves in relation to this deer. She searches a huge area in the spring to find prey. And then you can see she eventually kills this deer. And we were able to detect her coming in using cameras, coming back into her kill. So this is really interesting data because we can compare the different movement of these 2 different species to understand more about their dynamics. So we can use an approach called integrated step selection functions to analyze cougar movement in relation to mule deer and different habitat types. So I won't get into the nitty-gritty of this either, but it's just a similar kind of approach to a resource selection function, but it accounts for movement. So it's a conditional approach. So each point of cougar location data is matched with multiple different random locations. So it's called a conditional approach. And we can measure habitat on the end of points or along the steps that the cougars are taking. So we have maybe a mule deer on winter range hanging out, and then it migrates to an area where there's lots of cut blocks, which is what we are seeing basically on the mule deer project. And then we can look at what our cougars are doing around that same time frame. So are cougars following these mule deer to cut blocks, or what is the trajectory? Are they following a similar path? And one of our main hypotheses too is that we think because cougars are eating more mule deer in certain areas compared to others, like the West Okanagan versus the Kootenays, that cougars might follow their prey source where it's more important. So in the Kootenays, if cougars don't eat very many mule deer, we wouldn't expect them to follow mule deer migration routes. But in the Okanagan, where they're the main source of prey, they're probably important. So we want to know if cougar diet changes in the spring, summer when mule deer move out of the winter range, or are cougars moving with mule deer and continue consuming them. So lastly, we want to look at scavengers at cougar kills from this camera data. And we want to look at species diversity between our 2 areas where we have the most GPS collar data and the most kills that we visited. So that's between the West Okanagan and the Kootenays. And we want to separate this between winter and summer. So we get different birds coming in due to migration and residence and that sort of thing. So it's important to separate out the seasons. We want to look at competition at kills and feeding time for cougars. How much time do they spend consuming a meal? What is the weight of that meal or size of it? And are they impacted in any way from animals like bears or coyotes coming in and taking away calories from them or taking over the kill? What is the time frame between a cougar being on a kill and leaving and the next scavenger arriving? So we can look at the sort of temporal partitioning between cougars and these other scavengers. And an important factor too is that if cougars are being bumped off their kills repeatedly, they may be losing calories, losing energy, and having to make that up by killing more animals. So we can potentially look at an effect here with cougar kill rates on certain species. So this is a sample of 30 kill sites where we had cameras. So this is from late winter 2020 into early spring. So we don't have quite as many black bear detections just yet, but we have put out 150 cameras. I have a student, Cynthia, who is working on classifying the rest of our cameras this year. So this is just a subsample. But you can see we get in gray here, these are the collared cougars. So we call them unclassified because they're not actually scavenging. These are their own kills. But what I want to point out is that, yes, we get our own cougars on the kills, but we also get uncollared cougars coming in and consuming the meals. So sometimes it's uncollared, probably family members, subadults with their mother, something like that. But sometimes they come in and it's 2 weeks or a week after our collared cougar was there. So we are seeing uncollared cougars coming in and scavenging off of these kills. We often see coyotes, often see black bears on nearly every kill when black bears are out. Fewer gray wolves on kills, especially in the Kootenays, where there are many wolves than we were thinking there would be. We thought wolves would play a bigger role in this. We get many species of birds, corvids, birds of prey, that sort of thing. So some of the stuff we can look at with this data set is spatially with the distribution of these different scavengers. So we can look at where we're getting more detections of coyote and black bear. Sometimes we get one black bear coming into a kill, and sometimes we get up to 8 black bears, different individuals coming into the same carcass within the 30-day period. So we can analyze these different proportions of detections and compare these detections at the habitat that we're seeing at these kill sites. So what are the factors influencing what scavengers are coming into these kills, and what impact that might have on cougars? Okay, so next steps for this project, like I said, we've GPS collared 27 adults, and we're hoping to achieve our goal of 40 collared animals. We're looking to integrate more of the southern interior mule deer GPS data and camera detections. We're also including mortality sites. So Chloe investigates where her mule deer die from mortality signals on the collars, and many of them die from cougars. We can combine our mule deer predation cougar data with hers, and we'll have an even stronger predation risk map for mule deer based on these 2 different projects that collect the same data at the same time and in the same place. We also want to calculate the timing of scavengers at kills, and we're looking to develop, well, I am, the statistical models for cougar habitat use and movement in the next year or 2. So why are we doing all of this? It's important to collect baseline data to improve these statistical models. Like I showed earlier, the confidence intervals for cougar population estimates are very large. We want to shrink those, get a better sense of how many cougars are in these areas. We also want to know more about their habitat use based on cougar data. So the province uses deer habitat data at the moment to estimate where cougars are and how many there are. But we want to use real cougar data. That would just give us a much better estimate of where cougars are occurring in BC. And we want to know more about the relationship between cougars and the landscape and potential limitations for mule deer. And finally, so there's an upcoming cougar provincial management plan in British Columbia. So we're hoping that our research will help inform this management plan so that they can make better informed decisions on how to manage cougars and hunter harvest regulations as well. So knowing how many cougars are harvested every year is important and knowing how many cougars there are in the population. So we can know that we're not taking too many individuals out every year. For folks who might want to learn more about Southern BC Cougars, we have a website, and I have my Gmail. I'll bring it up again in a second. I also just want to put it out there. I know we're a little ways away from Saskatchewan, but if anybody in the talk today in the audience is interested, we are currently hiring 2 winter field technicians starting in January, and the ad for that job is posted on our website. So I just want to thank all of our project team members, volunteers, funders, and partners, Dr. Adam Ford, Dr. Karen Hodges, TJ Goliath, and Patrick Stent with the government, and all of our houndsmen and women and summer student technicians. This work couldn't be accomplished without all of these different partners, as well as the Okanagan Nation Alliance, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, which is a huge funder for us. So we've had lots of people out in the field supporting us and volunteers, and we couldn't collect all this data without all of these people. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to all of you for listening today. Yeah, so I have time for questions, I believe, and if we have a bit of extra time, I also have a short video if there's any interest. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go and stop the recording, but yeah, I know Siobhan has some video footage that if you want to go ahead and show that, that's great. But if people have questions and want to jump in, you're welcome to type them out in the chat or just unmute yourself.